Good morning. My name is Donna McKelvey, and I'm the Vice President of Alliance Development and Membership for Research America, an alliance advocating for science, discovery, and innovation to achieve better health for all. On behalf of our alliance members and our partners, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you this morning, and also a warm welcome to our viewers watching by the live stream. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about this very important topic. By addressing the gaps in the intellectual property framework surrounding the federally funded research and helping to foster a robust ecosystem for public-private partnership, the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act has played a pivotal role in fueling scientific and technological progress, conveying the benefits of federally funded research to the public, and in an ever-changing fiscal and economic climate, assuring sustained public and policymaker support for federal research funding. We are so thankful for our partners, the American Association for the Advancement of Science and our host today, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Association of American Universities, Autumn, and the Society for Neuroscience. We have a great panel lined up for you today, and I encourage each of you to read your programs to learn more about this distinguished panel. So now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our panel. We have Joe Allen, founder of Allen and Associates. We have Mark Booten, Chief Executive Officer for the National Health Council. Jessica Sibiak, Deputy Vice President for Federal Relations and Counsel for Policy at AAU. We have Ken Porter, Director, University of Maryland Ventures, College Park. And Steve Heinig, Director, Science Policy at AAMC. And of course, our moderator, Research America's own Vice President for Policy and Advocacy, Ms. Ellie Tahoney. Ellie, I turn it to you.
Thanks. So I want to start by letting you know, and some of you know this already, that I'm a New Yorker. Not only that, I'm a Long Islander. So I talk really quickly, and I often don't use contractions. I will not go to the mall. You can't make me go to the mall. I will not go to the mall. So if you hear any quirks, that's for me. On a serious note, I was thinking about tech transfer and BayhDole, and in advocacy, we start with the heart, typically. You don't start with the mind. And so I was looking at examples of tech transfer, and one arose that unfortunately is very, very timely. So I think, as you all know, the second largest outbreak of Ebola in history is ongoing. Democratic Republic of Congo, and now it's spread to Uganda. At least there's been one death in Uganda from Ebola. And then the biggest outbreak of Ebola happened in 2014. And at that time, the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, it's NIAID, so it's Allergy and Infectious Diseases, had been working on an Ebola vaccine since 2008, approximately. At the same time, academic researchers and then the private sector were working on a platform for delivering vaccines that was novel. And in 2014, NIAID and industry got together in a flash, unprecedented speed, signed a tech transfer agreement using the BayhDole principles. And within hours of signing that agreement, a clinical trial is underway for a GSK vaccine that is in use now in combination with 2 other vaccines in the current outbreak. So tech transfer plays a role that is real, that is important, and that touches lives and saves lives. And I just wanted to start there so that this doesn't seem like just a dry discussion about process and policy. This is about people. And with that, I'm going to turn to the real experts in the room here and ask some questions. And I'd really like to start with Joe Allen, who was one of the crafters of the Bayh-Dole Act. played a major role. And Joe, I'd love to get a feeling for the dynamics at that time, the reasoning behind Bayh-Dole, and what you consider to be some of its most important provisions.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm not from New York. I'm from D.C., and about 25 years ago, I moved out of D.C. and out to past Wheeling, West Virginia. I went to the bank one day, and the teller setting up my accounts actually stepped back and said, "You talk fast. You're not from around here, are you?" All right, so I'm going to actually try to talk a little bit more slowly, but I was on Senator Birch Bayh's staff. Senator Bayh just passed about 2 months ago from Indiana. And what I'd like to do is just give you a quick perspective on what we're talking about, because this really is a critical issue. If the government doesn't fund, the government does not develop products. That's not the role of the government. What the government's basically doing is one of two things. They're funding either basic research, which is how does science work, how do you advance knowledge, or they're doing mission research. How do you put astronauts on the moon or whatever? But they're not really doing commercialization. And what we found was if you don't have an industry partner, all these great ideas are just going to sit there. And the other thing which I want to emphasize, which people miss, is the risk in the whole system is on the industry partner. Typically, NIH estimates it costs $100 of development by the private sector for every $1 NIH put into the research. And the other thing you should realize is, the odds of actually getting a new product on the market are daunting. If you're talking about a new drug, if you start with 10,000 compounds, maybe 2 will make it to the market. Of the 2 that make it to the market, maybe 20% will actually turn a profit. So when projects fail, people in the private sector lose their jobs. No one at NIH, no university person loses their job if a technology isn't commercialized. But there are consequences. So what does Bayh-Dole do? We need to back up a little bit, actually a long way. We just had D-Day. At the end of World War II, President Roosevelt called in Vannevar Bush, and he said, and actually science helped win World War II. We won't go into that, that's another lecture. And Roosevelt asked Vannevar Bush, what do we do with all this infrastructure? We've actually got the government now funding all kinds of research. What do we do with it? Because one of the fears was, like World War I, you went into the Great Depression because suddenly all these guys came home, the economy crashed, and so Vannevar Bush came back with a proposal called Science, the Endless Frontier. And he said the government should now start funding basic research. He started the National Science Foundation. But what they said was, this is at the end of World War II, we'll have a Marshall Plan of technology like a Marshall Plan of economic development. If the government funds research and you make an invention, the government will take it away from you and make it freely available. That'll be really fair. Well, it sounded really good in 1945. By the time John Kennedy was president, about 15 years later, it became obvious that nothing was being commercialized because companies did not have any incentive to actually develop a product because anybody else could go back and get the same rights. So President Kennedy and then later President Nixon came up with a policy where they could actually waive rights to the inventing organization where you could own your technology and try to commercialize it. They also found that if the government took the technology, the odds of it ever going anywhere were abysmal. They had 28,000 government patents, less than 5% were ever licensed because there was no incentive. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson, who was not a very patient person, called somebody in and said, how many drugs are being commercialized from all this NIH research? And I would hate to be the aide that came back with the answer. The answer was none. Why? Because they had destroyed the incentives that companies needed to commercialize a product. So Lyndon Johnson, not being someone who's going to sit around and suffer fools lightly, encouraged NIH to come up with a program called the Institutional Patents Agreement, which allowed universities with a tech transfer office, they could actually own their technology for the first time, they could commercialize it, and the government could use it for free. Suddenly, you started having technologies being commercialized. 30% were being licensed as opposed to 5% when the government owned it. And you actually started having something happening there. When President Carter came in, his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Health, Education, and Welfare at that time, didn't like the policy, so he stopped it. So suddenly you went back to the case-by-case reviews. That triggered some universities to come in. Purdue, from Indiana, came in to talk to us one day. We'd never heard of this issue before, but we thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I didn't realize this at the time, but Senator Bayh's wife had breast cancer, and she was actually out at NIH for treatment, which she was very impressed with. And somebody out there was telling her about all the great technologies they had there, but they were just sitting there because there was no incentive to commercialize them. So Senator Bayh, and then we found out Senator Dole, who was a conservative Republican, had the same interest. To show you how long ago it was, there actually was a chance of actually having bipartisan people working together to solve a problem, which didn't mean Bayh and Dole got along all the time because they were on opposing teams, but it just didn't make sense to waste billions of dollars of taxpayer funding. The other thing is, if you're old like me, you remember the 1970s and 1980s, we had a thing called the misery index. This is how Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter. The misery index was we had double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment, and people were not happy. So we had a hearing. We did not have a single company testify they wanted to work with universities because we developed a chasm between the public and private sector because the government was going to take any technology away, even if they funded a small part of it. So industry wanted nothing to do with universities. Long story short, we passed the Bayh-Dole Act. What did Bayh-Dole do? If you ever walk by the Department of Commerce, actually you can get an education just reading the side of buildings. There's a quote from President Lincoln that actually faces the White House. And it says, the patent system adds the fuel of interest to the fires of genius. Actually, Lincoln was a patent owner. So what did Bayh-Dole do? We put back the incentives of patent ownership into government-funded research. We said universities can own inventions they make. The royalties they get back, if something's commercialized, have to be shared with the inventor, and they have to go back to research. The government can use them for its own purposes. You have to give a preference for small companies and people who will make the product in the United States. And Bayh-Dole created no new bureaucracy. The role was the government funds the research, we have some set rules there which are predictable, and the government gets out of the way. So that's where we left it in 1980. Just as the law passed, Senator Bayh lost the election. We're out of work. I was actually sitting with my son, who was about 5 years old at the time, watching the election returns come in. We were going to go to a Democratic victory party, which was highly ironic. And the first return was Walter Cronkite says, Reagan carries Indiana and Birch Bayh loses. Well, that was my boss. And my son, Zach, looked at me and said, Dad, does that mean I don't get an allowance anymore? And I said, you're probably right. So that's where we left it. Well, what happened at the same time? Luckily, by happenstance, Stanford University and University of California had the basic biotech process called the Boyer-Cohen or Cohen-Boyer, depending on which university you're from. That was the fundamental driver of the US biotech industry. Before 1980, the UK was ahead of the United States in biotech, and Europe was way ahead of us in the life sciences. So what happened with biotech? Big pharma companies were not interested because there was a new technology. I mean, nobody knew what it was. There was a lot of public concern about it. So they actually spun out new companies, like Genentech came out of universities. Suddenly, university tech transfer was on the map. And that's grown and grown and grown until today. It's one of the major drivers of the economy. BayhDole has become the gold standard of getting public-funded research into the market. In fact, I'm going to Egypt next week. Egypt's looking at a BayhDole. I was in Kazakhstan. I was in South Africa. South Africa has a Bayh-Dole Act. The United States now, every day of the year, Yom Kippur, New Year's Day, 4th of July, the university technologies start 2 new companies and 2 new technologies every day of the year from government-funded research. It's become a major driver of the economy. And back to what Ellie said, the other thing that's critical is you're now having potential cures for diseases no longer being potential, they're now being put in the marketplace. And that doesn't just benefit US taxpayers, this goes around the world. So if you ever talk to a university researcher, they're not that much into patenting and licensing, and the royalties are nice, but why are you in the public sector? Because you have a passion for your area. The last thing you want to do as a public sector researcher is you have a potential cure for disease, which is killing people, maiming people, Lord knows what. That's what you spent your whole life in. But if you don't have an industry partner, it's going to be a paper. It's not going to be anything that you can use and going to help change human lives. So the reason that we did Bayh-Dole was not to make universities rich, which are not rich on tech transfer. It was not to, we didn't want to think about the economics of it as much. We were really thinking about the American taxpayers who are funding billions of dollars in government-funded research deserve a real return on investment through economic growth, but more importantly, better lives and better health, and that's why we did Bayh-Dole.
Perfect. Can you repeat that wonderful Fuels.
Oh, Ellie, go read the Commerce Department.
See, you
Yes.
can tell I'm
No, I
losing my memory.
Okay, no, I can't.
Fuels.
This is President Lincoln. It was in when he was actually running for the Senate, which he lost. He said the patent system adds the fuel of interest to the fires of genius.
Genius.
And what it means is if you can't own what your ideas are, you can't develop them. If anybody else can get the same access to your ideas that you do, particularly if there are things that actually take a lot of time, they're not going to be developed. And that's really, it's something unfortunately we keep forgetting. But after this meeting, go and read the sides of public buildings. And there's a lot of wisdom up there, which apparently people don't pay much attention to.
Like me. You mentioned universities. I'd love to move to Jessica. And Jessica, what do you think the impact has been on universities and researchers within those universities? Can you kind of give us a flavor of that?
Sure. So I'm just going to step back a little bit. So I'll mention that before I became an attorney and a higher ed advocate, I was a historian. And I was recently writing a chapter of a book about university technology transfer. And because I used to be a historian, my first place I visited, other than talking to Joe here, was digging into the Association of American Universities archives. And we have archives going back to the early part of the 20th century. And what I discovered in the course of my research was that questions of university, the applications of university research and potential for commercialization has been something that's preoccupied university presidents, for over a century. So just looking back a little farther than the origins of BayhDole here, this is really something that universities have been thinking about for a very long time. And so I just wanted to make sure we all have that longitudinal perspective on this. Universities have really also wrestled with these notions and the sort of sense of, well, what is pure basic research, what is applied research, and what is the appropriate and proper relationship between universities and industry partners and the marketplace. Not everyone has shared the same opinions on these questions, but I think it's also important to understand that these are not new questions, these are not new debates, and so they are still live on our campuses. And I would just say, and of course I defer to my colleagues from Autumn and elsewhere to talk about some of the mechanics of what BayhDole has meant for universities. But I would say, harking back to what Joe said, it really has given academics, I think, a new paradigm for thinking about the research. And I think there's still an appreciation, of course, that basic research is extraordinarily important, and even if something doesn't ultimately become a commercializable product, it still adds to the stock of human knowledge, which is critical, which itself, of course, is a return on investment. But as Joe also said, sometimes if your idea is on paper and it stays on paper, it's not necessarily going to have the downstream impact that it otherwise might. So I think the one big influence of BayhDole certainly is that it kind of granted some additional legitimacy to thinking about the commercialization process and thinking that it is okay, you can still be an honorable academic and think about maybe what the longer term effects of your basic research are. And so I think that's been really critical. And of course we see a lot of university research, often published in open access, gets cited in later patents. And so I think it's really important to, again, look at this whole ecosystem in which BayhDole has played a really critical role.
Jessica, a question along those lines. How is tech transfer in universities funded?
It depends on the university. And different universities have different models for technology transfer. And again, I also defer to my colleague here to get into some further details. But my understanding is that universities, sometimes the central administration will fund tech transfer operations. Sometimes tech transfer offices are self-funded, which I know from speaking to folks from those universities can sometimes present a little bit of a challenge because it may create some conflicts of, or potential conflicts of interest because one of the things we at the association level like to emphasize certainly is that ultimately technology transfer activities at our institutions really need to be conducted in the public interest with an eye ultimately on the benefit to society and the public. And so, of course, if you're in a self-funding technology transfer office, maybe your incentives are to look at revenue generation more than some of the other ends to which you might license your products. So again, I'm not trying to cascade. Everybody has their different challenges on their institutions, and of course, every institution is extraordinarily heterogeneous, both in terms of its financial structure, its geographical location, its student body size, its faculty size, and so forth and so on. But I think those are the two primary models.
Ken, it sounds like there are about 1 million questions for you, but what I'd love for you to do now, if you would, is you have some recent data on the impact of BayhDole that you could share with us. That would be just terrific. Do you have the clicker thing? Okay.
I don't.
Oh, you will.
Thanks, Ellie. Yes, I work at the University of Maryland. I've been there since October. Really happy to be here. It's a great community. But I'm also on the board of directors of AUTUM. AUTUM is a professional association of technology transfer practitioners. We're about 3,000 strong, 80% in the U.S. And we advocate for intellectual property and technology transfer. We educate. We have training programs around the world. And one of the things we're very well known for is the AUTUM annual survey, so the licensing survey. We collect data. We collect data from, right now it's 200 technology transfer offices across the U.S., and we publish that. And Joe, thanks for the history lesson. I was going to start with that a little bit, but I don't need to now. But just to remind everyone that 1980 is the year of the Bayh-Dole Act, and it's officially called the Patent and Trademark Act Amendments of 1980. So going back, patents are in the Constitution. The original Patent Act was in 1790, and Thomas Jefferson was an author, so we're standing on some tall shoulders. Before Bayh-Dole, before the amendment in 1980, when the federal government took title to university inventions, about 250 patents were issued per year. But from the AUTUM survey in 2017, 7,500 US patents were issued. The economic impact for 2017, again from the AUTUM survey, about 8,000 licenses executed, 755 new products introduced to the market, 1,000 startups started, and 6,000 startups that came from university technology still in operation. And I never forget to mention that was with zero appropriation from Congress. So, AUTUM, in cooperation with BIO, produces a report on the economic impact of technology transfer. The first one was done in 2017. The second edition announced just 2 weeks ago at the BIO meeting in Philadelphia. And BIO takes the data produced from the AUTUM annual survey and compiles it and then analyzes the economic impact. And so the report is from 22 years of AUTUM data. And these are the results. So, the economic impact of technology transfer from 1996 to 2017. The technology transfer from university research supported 5.9 million jobs, bolstered the U.S. gross domestic product by $865 billion, and boosted industrial gross output to $1.7 trillion. So significant impact from university research to the markets.
Yeah, that's terrific, and I want to emphasize a point you made: zero appropriations. So, for those in the audience who have worked in Congress, anything you want to do in terms of passing a bill, the first stumbling block is the cost. If it's an appropriation, then not only do you have to have the bill passed with the knowledge that it's going to cost money, but then you have to convince appropriators to actually allocate that money on an annual basis to get the job done. So a piece of legislation that has an impact like this, where there's zero cost in that piece of legislation, is a miracle in the policy world. The staffers are happy because we might actually be able to pass legislation. It's really remarkable, as are the results here. So thanks so much, Ken. Let me move now to Steve. And you and I have been talking about biomedical advances in particular, not surprisingly, Research America focuses on medical and health research along with broad science, but medical and health research is kind of our core mission. And so could you speak a little bit to the impact of BayhDole in that arena?
Thank you, Ellie. Actually, I'm really happy to be here. I work with the association that represents the medical schools in the United States and the academic medical centers. But where I think BayhDole has been especially important to us for reasons I'll outline, and I think that follow on what Jess and Joe had set up. But I want to remind that our members also include, as I say, teaching hospitals. Many universities either own hospitals and health systems, or they are affiliated closely with hospitals and health systems where their faculties work and where students go and train. And it's a very interesting part of the cycle, because I don't think there's many other parts of the university where you're involved in basic research and you're also involved in the area where it gets implemented. But it's a critical mission for our members and those university components to actually be in the delivery of healthcare, and also more and more involved in the communities as a community service, either through medical schools or schools of public health. So we really have it at both ends, and I think it also will reflect some of our views and concerns on things going forward. The knowledge flows generated by academic medicine have always been really important to pharmaceutical development and to healthcare, even prior to BayhDole. But the ability to actually go ahead and to have the unambiguous authority to negotiate a patent on behalf of the inventors and the government funders it removes the ambiguity that might otherwise entail when you're actually dealing with a company. So to try and get more specific, and I'm going to be very remedial here because I think many of you are already aware of it, but when in the course of investigating a mechanism of disease, say inflammation or cancer or that, if the academic lab is fortunate enough to stumble on a molecular entity that can interfere or change the progression of a disease, that molecule often is patentable. It's got utility, but it's not really very useful at that point. Someone has to screen it and characterize it, figure out if it's stable, figure out what else it combines with. Can you scale it up? How do you deliver it? Does it even, if you deliver it, does it do what you hope it would do? Unfortunately, in most cases, they do not. They have to test it for the safety, if there's other off-target effects or side effects. The research involves use of animals, and then if it gets that far, clinical trials, and then there's a succession of clinical trials, and none of that's cheap. And in our country, and the way we do it is, we do it through private investment, and in order to attract the private investment, you have to be able to put a kind of intellectual property boundary around it, and exclusivity. So those investors that know that they're putting their money in will be able to recoup it and then some after. More frequently, I guess, in the earlier, in the decade or so after BayhDole, it was probably more common to sell or license, I should say, the technology directly to a large pharmaceutical company, in the case of drug development. But more and more, it's building a smaller, like, startup around the technology, and then, if successful, that startup gets purchased by the larger company. But there's still a substantial amount of development that goes through it. But I love the Bayh-Dole Act in that there's a paradox. I mean, we advocate very, very strongly for support, as does Research America, for support of NIH and the VA, the Veterans Administration and CDC, et cetera. We argue for public taxpayer support of those organizations as a public good. And yet, at the heart of the BayhDole, we recognize that we also need the ability to secure proprietary rights to certain things as not in themselves, but as a means to an end. in order to see that those are developed. There are some very exciting advances that have been made since BayhDole. Just to note, well, a colleague, Ashley Stevens, and researchers that Ashley works with in a famous 2011 paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, identified that over 40 years, they found 153 new FDA drugs, including vaccines and other indications, that were delivered through the technology that came out of, they had their own acronym for it, but basically publicly funded research institutions like our medical schools and independent research centers. So among the drugs, Gleevec is probably one of the more famous. It was developed through the 1990s. One of the researchers was at Oregon Health and Science University. And Gleevec was imatinib, is the generic name for it. But it was the first of the cancer drugs to actually target the cancer cells as opposed to like a chemotherapy that killed new cell growth. And so that came online in 2001, and then there a class of drugs called kinase inhibitors. It was specific to chronic myeloid leukemia, which was somewhat rare but still usually fatal condition for which there wasn't very good treatment before. It's had, for those patients who adapt to it, it's been very effective. There's been follow-on kinase inhibitors to come out of that and targeting other types of cancer. And then I just quickly want to point out what's more frequently in the news now is the research by Jim Allison, who was at UC Berkeley, then at Sloan Kettering, and I guess now is at MD Anderson when he won the Nobel Prize. Jim Allison and Tetsuko Honjo from Japan were most prominent in the development of drugs known as checkpoint inhibitors, which interrupt the ability of certain cancer cells to evade the immune system.
Wow.
Again, it started off as very fundamental academic research, but they saw this applied opportunity. There was a startup that was built around the checkpoint inhibitors, and going forward, we hope that there's a lot of promise for those. There's actually, I have several more examples, but it would take time, and perhaps we could come back to them after. But again, this wanting to do good for the global population, your Ebola example, often necessitates, we have the concept of enlightened self-interest. There's also an enlightened public interest in order to bring some of these drugs into application and into reality, really, and into application. But I also, I think it's in the air. The price of many of these drugs, the cost of many of these drugs are very, very expensive, and it's created a whole new area of public concern and public debate. There have been, in my view, misguided efforts to incorporate provisions of the Bayh-Dole Act to affect prices and of pharmaceuticals. I hope there are other ways to do that, but that might be an area for further discussion with the panel or in the question and answering. And
I think that's, Stephen, 2 points there. I mean, those examples are absolutely striking in terms of the public good and as you said, enlightened public interest. And I think that same term bears on the last issue you raised, and I think we will discuss a bit more about some of the controversy around the use of the Bayh-Dole Act. And again, I would agree with you. I think that it's a use that is a bit counterproductive and counterintuitive to the goal of helping patients. But I like enlightened public interest. That's terrific. I might tattoo that on my left arm. I'd love to move to Mark to talk about patient perspective and your perspective on the impact of this act and its meaning for the patient community in particular.
Sure. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and you've heard a lot of great things about this act, and from a patient perspective, to see the medications that are coming out that treat so many people is incredible. And it's something I think we actually take for granted. But I want to take a step back for a moment and explain that the patient community, which as an advocacy organizations, we've actually been in this country for over 300 years. For many of us, we've focused in on getting cures. In fact, many have that written right into their mission statement that they want to find a cure and provide support services for the people they represent. And we're now at a point in time where science is moving us to that place where cures, durable treatments, some cases one-time only treatments, are either coming onto the market very quickly or in development. So we're in a really, really exciting point in terms of science. But I can tell you, as an organization that represents a large number of patient advocacy organizations, we look to them and to their constituents to understand what people are feeling and thinking. And I want to be clear that in our community, innovation is critical. We want new, better treatments. And that goes across the board, whether you're dealing with heart disease, mental health, neurologic, autoimmune, cancer. The reality is very few of us have a pill that you take without any side effects and we're done. We're getting there. But I can also tell you that for the people we represent, one of the biggest concerns they have is meaningful, affordable access to care. And that has shifted just in the last several years. And it's shifted for a lot of reasons. We've put tremendous burden on co-insurance, co-payments, high deductibles, premium costs for people with chronic conditions. And I would argue that we've largely undermined the fundamental purpose of insurance, where we've actually driven costs to people with chronic condition, and they're actually funding the premiums of healthy people. So we have a really challenging place where people with chronic conditions are saying, I can't get meaningful access to basic care. And for the first time, I'm hearing from people with complex chronic conditions that are deadly without any treatment saying, you know what, innovation is important, but I can't get basic care. That is a fundamental shift that we've seen. And as a result, over the last several years, we've taken on healthcare costs, and it usually focuses in on drug costs. But be very clear, in the United States, we pay between 200 and 400% more for every aspect of care, including drugs. This is a big challenge for us. And we need to look at meaningful ways to address high costs and bring them down, including drug costs. But we have to do it in a smart way. We have to continue to drive innovation. We got to get that balance right. And when I can tell you that from our members' perspective, one of the number one issue is affordability, they want us to do this right. And when you look at achieving public good, it's a real challenge. We all like to think everybody wants public good. And I think by and large most of us do. But the reality is you have to incentivize public good, and you have to remove the barriers for it to work. And if you don't get the public outcomes you'd like. It's the whole premise behind the patent system, and it's the premise behind BayhDole. And I think it's really important to understand that this is a statute that Congress enacted that was bipartisan, that largely worked as it was intended without any unintended consequences. When does that happen? What other examples do we have in the last 40 years? One of my greatest fears is this solved in a very artful way an incredibly complex problem that most people didn't even know we had. And we've now had the benefits of that for 40 years. And I can tell you, and Ellie, you don't know this. For the last 4 months, I've been dealing with a really challenging health issue, trying to figure out what it was. Finally got a diagnosis just over a week and a half ago. And it's a rare autoimmune condition where my white blood cells are attacking my stomach. And it's caused me to lose almost 20 pounds. It's been incredible. I'm sitting here not sure that I'll make it through the session, that uncomfortable. It brings my blood pressure down so low that I run the risk of passing out, that my vision sometimes becomes a tunnel down to 30%. It's been incredibly difficult. I'm so thankful to finally get this diagnosis of this rare autoimmune condition. The reality is there are 3 treatments. One's a generic, very low cost. The other 2 supported by BayhDole, but they're very expensive products. I don't know yet which one I'm going to be on, but I'm right in the middle of this place of needing an innovative treatment, but needing to make sure that I can afford it without driving up costs. I get these challenges, and I can tell you there are 160 million people in the United States dealing with chronic conditions, dealing with affordability. But you know what? I was so happy to finally get a diagnosis and know that there are highly effective treatments. I'm not going to spend the next 3 months the way I did the last 3 months. That's incredible. That's what this legislation has done. And we have to be really careful not to misuse it. Everybody's heard of the margin rights. And there's been a lot of discussion about using margin rights under BayhDole. Pretty clear that's not what it was intended for. But it's also incredibly clear that you do that once, and no pharmaceutical or biotech company is going to take the product from a university and develop it because it's too much uncertainty. I've worked with the pharmaceutical companies as an advocate now for the last 25 years. And as innovative as they are the most risk-averse group of people I've ever met in my entire life. They will not develop a product if they can't guarantee that they have the intellectual property behind it to support the cost of development. We march in once, and I get it, it's a super powerful tool to negotiate on pricing. Get it. But we do it once, and all this benefit goes away. That's a huge challenge for us. Now let me tell you, I've testified before Congress on drug pricing. We're supporting a variety of legislative actions and regulatory actions on pricing. We in the patient community have got to step up and say enough is enough here. And we've got to do our part. We have to do this smartly. We have to get the right balance. So thank you.
You know, that's, you know, you're strumming my pain with your fingers here. I think for any advocate, for patients and for researchers, what Mark said is so profoundly true, is that in order to get to goal, we have to do 2 things. We have to innovate, the drugs have to be there, the preventives have to be there, they have to exist. And then we have to take seriously affordability. But to use affordability to mute innovation leaves us with 0. And for patients, that is tragic. And it's finding that path. And so that's one of the reasons it's so important to understand BayhDole and the BayhDole Act's role in innovation and driving more tech transfer, which produces more options, and more options in itself is an answer to an affordability question. So, Joe, please.
I can't top that. I was actually in England or the UK in February. I was meeting with the Minister of Education looking at BayhDole. And before I left, the night before I was turning on the BBC, and they had a story there about these, two working class couple whose son was dying of a rare disease. Now, people look at the European healthcare market as so much cheaper than the United States. The government denied them the only drug that had any chance of helping their kid because it was too expensive. Now, think about that. Drugs can be expensive, particularly if you're looking at orphan drugs with a small patient population. But the government-controlled healthcare system The bureaucracy says, nope, that's too expensive, you can't have it. That kid's going to die. So when people look at how better the European system is, or these other systems where the government arbitrarily says what you can and can't have, drugs are expensive. There's certainly unscrupulous people in every profession, and there are, I'm sure, in the pharmaceutical industry, but the fact is, by the very nature of the high risk, and particularly with a small patient population, these things are expensive, particularly when they first came out. But as bad as our system may be, at least you're not being told, sorry, pal, go with the generic, because it's cheaper. So again, it's easy to get emotional about how much things cost, and we should, but there's another side of the equation which you never hear about, which is the government telling you, sorry, pal, your kid's going to die. And that doesn't happen all the time, but I was shocked. I mean, I was sitting there in my bed thinking, oh my God, what are these people going to do? And the fact is, they don't have any options. In that system, you don't have any way around it. You can't buy it yourself. You're just told no, and then knows the answer. So God bless you, but it's about time somebody actually started telling the other side of the story, because controlling drug prices is not simple. And in fact, if you look at what's going on Capitol Hill right now, they've gone through the phase where they've done the sound bites for industry, for the media. Now they're actually looking at real legislation. And you're seeing now it's suddenly slowed down, because suddenly when you look at, okay, we're going to ratchet down prices this way, you also kill innovation. And that doesn't come back. Once you do that, if you're a venture capitalist, you're putting money into a new drug. You put money in today. If you're lucky, you may get something back in a decade. And even then, the odds are, even if it hits the market, you may not get your money back. The other thing that never is mentioned is 50% of our new drugs come from small companies. So you've got a VC who put money into your company, hoping maybe in 10 years or maybe 12 years or 15 years you're going to make it. There very well could be another thing that comes on from somebody else who actually knocks you out of the market. And suddenly somebody's going to tell you in the very beginning, this is what you have to sell it for, when no one has any idea what the price is, how much you have to go through there. It's a really, really complex issue. But the one thing we can say for sure is, if you mess around with BayhDole and put price control in there, you're going to kill the bill. And there was never, I staffed the hearing, I wrote the report, I oversaw the law at the Commerce Department. I can tell you unequivocally that has never been the intent of BayhDole. It's not how the law works. And what Senator Bayh said, which he told the people who wanted to do this, he said, okay, if you want to do that, you amend BayhDole. You can't just suddenly undermine the law with this is how it's supposed to, with your interpretation of it. You amend BayhDole and you put in statute, what's a reasonable price? And that'll never be done, because no one can tell you today what a reasonable price is for a university invention that's sitting on the shelf that may be commercialized or may not be commercialized in 10 years. It's impossible. And that's really what's at stake.
I completely agree, and I just want to add, several years ago when we began looking at healthcare costs, we did an exhaustive review of policies that had been proposed to address healthcare costs, including drug pricing, and it was nearly 200. And we went through a process of looking at which ones actually were addressing costs in a way that didn't reduce access. You'd be surprised at how many said, we will reduce healthcare costs, but we'll do it by taking away care to people. Take that group away, and then we reviewed them for a variety of things. But one of the things we learned in this was we looked at how much data existed to support whether or not it would actually bring down cost. And what we found is virtually every proposal had either no data or very, very limited data, which meant these were ideas but didn't have the data to back it up. And they're being proposed as solving the problem. And often very simple solutions to very complex issues. We've got to navigate this carefully, and I think it's critical that the patient community is in the middle of this, because we're the ones footing those bills, we're getting those costs, and we're the ones who are going to be hurt if we don't get the products. And again, just want to underscore that BayhDole is a tool to drive innovation. It was never meant, as you've heard, to be a tool to drive down costs. And to use it for that purpose is akin to killing the goose, because the golden eggs are too expensive. We still want more golden eggs. And yeah, we do need to figure out how to drive down costs, and there are some mechanisms that I think could have a positive impact. But we do not want to kill the goose. Simple.
We're going to go to audience questions in just one moment. I want to raise another issue that has come up around BayhDole that bears on patients in a different way, if true. And that is, if BayhDole has switched incentives from basic research to applied research, that's not good for patients either. Because without the seed corn, you're not going to get to the applied place in research. You're not going to get to the end goal. You want those basic researchers out there uncovering the knowledge and then is taken to the finish line. So I'm hoping that one of our panelists, I know there's been some research looking at the impact of BayhDole in this arena, and Ken, maybe you can help us answer that question about basic versus applied and the impact of BayhDole.
Thanks, Ellie. Since I just came to Maryland a few months ago, we've been working on our strategic plan and figuring out how things are different now, how we can better align our activities with our mission with the mission of the university. And so think about that. So what's the mission of the university? It's research and education. And for the education, we provide students with experiential educational opportunities, whether they're interested in business or intellectual property law or entrepreneurship. We can provide a living laboratory for them, so check that box. How about research? So what is the mission of the research enterprise at the university? It's knowledge creation and dissemination. So knowledge creation, we do that mainly by facilitating corporate partnerships that bring expertise and funding in to university professors to advance their research programs. And then the dissemination part, that's the part everybody talks about with technology transfer. We, through our startups and our licenses, help disseminate information that's created by the research enterprise to scale its impact. There was a study in 2012 released by the National Academy of Sciences. It's called Managing University Intellectual Property in the Public Interest. It's a great paper, and I still live by a lot of the findings and recommendations in that paper. But they looked at knowledge dissemination. They found 8 principal ways knowledge that's created by a university is disseminated. So what you usually think of is academic publication and presentation. So that's the traditional way of knowledge dissemination out of a university. They went further, and so one more, students graduate and become employed. So people don't think about that a lot, but that's a great way for knowledge to be transferred to the private sector. And then there's direct transfer. So corporations can sponsor research at a university, and knowledge can be translated that way. There are university industry cooperative research centers where academic faculty and corporate scientists, industry scientists work together on solving problems. There's consulting, where faculty work directly with companies, and then startups and licensing, so the tech transfer part of things. So when you look at knowledge dissemination, tech transfer plays a direct role in 2 of 8 major mechanisms, but those 2 draw a lot of attention. That's why we talk about things like this. It's tip of mind for lots of folks. But further into the study, they looked at this issue as do these incentives skew the research that goes on in a university. And the National Academy found that faculty entrepreneurial activity does not undermine the missions of knowledge creation and dissemination. Further, the research demonstrated that commercial motives, faculty share in any profits that are generated from our licenses, has not shifted away efforts from fundamental research towards applied research. Institutional or sponsor concerns to protect IP rights have not delayed publication. We're very careful in our licenses to put checks and balances in with any protection, because the mission of the university is to publish, or that's what faculty are graded on, is their publication, the number and the quality of their publications. And so any involvement with the industry can't stand in the way of that, because that would stand in the way of the faculty's career. And actually, commercially oriented faculty are more prolific producers of academic articles. And finally, commercial involvement in IP activity have not replaced scholarly output as the principal criteria for academic employment and achievement. So the National Academy thinks it not.
Jessica, do you have anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, so I definitely would echo all of that, and I just think it's, again, in our universities, certainly we haven't seen any major or fundamental shift away from basic research. I think it's also really important to remember that in many cases that these discoveries from universities are, their value is in that they are early stage and that they are experimental, and it's not always immediately clear or obvious what the therapeutic outcome or therapeutic benefit will be. And so really, pharmaceutical companies rely on universities because they've to some extent shuttered their basic research shops. And so without this pipeline of basic research, I think that's, these discoveries wouldn't come to fruition ultimately. So, I think we need to recognize, of course, that there are also some complementary forms of expertise that exist between universities and pharmaceutical companies, and that it's the universities are creating this fundamental research, but they don't necessarily have the follow-on expertise or the capacity to again bring these to fruition. Right. So, and again, it's adding to the stock of human knowledge one way or another, and that sometimes leads to follow-on knowledge. And so, then under BayhDole, of course, any income from discoveries is reinvested in research. And again, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of it is basic research.
That's an important point. I don't think that it's come out yet. So that the royalty payments that attend to universities goes back into the research ecosystem at the university.
Yeah, so not just royalties to the inventors themselves. So if you sort of dispel the notion that this is all purely profit-driven by certain commercial-minded scholars, again, it goes back into the larger research enterprise.
So let's stop there and see if folks in the audience have questions, comments, add to the discussion. Aha, we have a taker.
Hi, my name is Cindy Pasca. I'm with the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, and I got some questions in advance, but that's not what I'm going to ask.
Perfect.
So I don't know enough about the details behind the act, so I'm going to ask a question that takes the research, the tech transfer, and it has to get to market. So what's the portion that the FDA plays in the approval that allows this to get to market?
Well, the FDA doesn't really get involved in the tech transfer part. Basically, when you start with a university invention, it's actually an idea more than a product. It's like, this may have some application. We think it may do this. We don't even know what it does. So when the University Tech Transfer Office is looking for a licensee, a lot of times it's really not clear what's going to happen. And the other misconception is people think there's companies just lined up outside the door. If you talk to MIT, Stanford, if they get one company interested, they're ecstatic. So it takes a lot of hard work to actually find anybody even interested in doing it. So the first part of the deal is you have to do the deal. You have to find a company, you negotiate, it's a negotiation, we're going to give you this up front, we're going to give you this right to it, and then it goes over to the company side. So you start doing your research. Obviously it would be a drug for the FDA. So there's a long step between, I licensed the technology from Georgia Tech, we've done our preclinical stuff, it looks like we may have some application. Then you start the expensive part, which is going through the different phases of the Food and Drug Administration. And the irony there is every step gets more expensive and riskier. You start out with 10,000 compounds. By the time you go through phase 3, you may have one that's actually still alive. So, and again, the FDA, every time you go through phase 1, 2, 3, the odds get steeper as far as actually getting approved. That doesn't mean you're going to make any money. That means now you're actually out marketing it. So then you got to say, okay, I've got this new thing. You got to let people know about it. There's other competing products out there. So if you want to make easy money, this isn't for you. But the Food and Drug Administration, and again, it's not involved in the tech transfer part, but again, in any of the life sciences, that's where you find the companies are like, And here's the other thing. Actually, I was just reading this morning. When these things fail, people lose their jobs. I was just reading this morning about a whole biotech sector that's shutting down now because they keep getting turned down by the FDA. So there are real life consequences to this. Again, if you're a small company and you're spending 10 years maybe without a salary, try that. You're trying to find a VC, that's going to actually fund you and wait for 10 years to get paid back if they're lucky. So this is a really high-risk thing, and here's the other thing. We are one of the few countries that actually has this model. We're 60% of all the world's drugs come from the United States. We're the ones taking the risk. We're the ones who are taking the expense. The other countries don't pay us back when something fails. And then if you are successful and you start selling in Europe, they will arbitrarily tell you what price you can sell it for. So again, it's a really complicated system, but certainly the FDA is one of the main, again, God love them. You don't want to have people having unsafe things out there, but that's the 500-pound gorilla in the room when you start developing a drug.
I thought I'd mention too that the FDA, that is correct, the FDA evaluation, and that comes after, a lot of the development that goes on in the private sector. It could be a subject for another panel. 4 years after Bayh-Dole, there was a very important piece of legislation, the Hatch-Waxman Act, that had provisions that were focused on FDA to help expedite the approval of generic versions of proprietary drugs going through, so that once a patent had run its life of protection, that other companies were set to pick up and produce it. And that has, I think, a lot of potential. That's had an effect on the price of drugs, and I think it has a lot of potential going forward to try and address that area on the drug thing and not look to the Bayh-Dole Act.
So I thought I would just chime in with a few statistics on this point that might be helpful. So, as Joe said, most of these ideas end in failure, unfortunately, and less than 10% of drugs that enter clinical trials even get to FDA approval. So it's a pretty shockingly low amount, and it takes about 10 years and $2 billion even to get to the point of FDA approval. And then, of course, FDA approval doesn't ensure clinical adoption. So there's a lot of bodies along the way, sorry, literally and figuratively.
But Cindy, I think your question is definitely relevant because it is another regime where there are incentives, a lot having to do with making sure generics can get to the market and still preserving innovation. So are there other?
Okay, Ross McKinney, AAMC. So often what drives policy is not data, it's stories. So I'm going to give you a story and ask for your reaction, because it's the kind of story that I see as the real threat to Bayh-Dole, in spite of the fact that you could take the story to be exactly the opposite. This is the incentivization that actually leads to something. So Mark, you were really onto it with the goose and the golden egg. So it's the story of a uniformly fatal disease, spinal muscular atrophy, which kills children as infants. It is uniformly fatal. And Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, led research that led to a gene therapy that was licensed to a startup company. The startup company then licensed it to, or was consumed, I actually don't know, by Novartis. And so this is a curative therapy. Children died, children live. And the trouble is that the price that's been set is $2.1 million. The story reads as blackmail. Your child is going to die. Give us $2.1 million or your child dies. How is this not foreseen as blackmail instead of being the cost of what it takes to develop a really impressive, miraculous new therapy? Because as a story, it comes across very badly. And the reason the Europeans have gone to that model is they say, we will not accept that story of it being $2.1 million. We're going to have to find some other way to fund this development because we won't accept our children to be victims of blackmail. So how do we change the story and preserve something that's actually been quite useful to society?
I think you're dead on, and you're talking about now the world's most expensive medication, and probably one of the world's highest value medications. I think we can flip that narrative, because again, without BayhDole, that product would not exist. The challenge has got to be bifurcating the development from the cost. Because I remember having a conversation with the CEO of Sanofi about a year ago, and they were starting to reframe their conversation, because for decades we've been told by pharmaceutical companies that the prices reflect the development costs. No, you're shaking your head, and for those of you who don't see him shaking his head, that's the biggest load of crap I've ever heard in my entire life. And I had this conversation with the CEO, and he said, we're going to start talking about pricing the products based on value. And he goes, how do you think the patient community will react to that? I said, well, there's two reactions. One is value right now is usually a construct set by the payers, not necessarily by all stakeholders, and certainly rarely reflects what we in the patient community value. So there's a challenge there in terms of what is value. But secondly, the patient community never believed this rhetoric that it was the development cost. So that was not an issue from my perspective. I think we have to get out of that construct that this is the development cost. We have to have a legitimate conversation about pricing. Now, this is the most expensive product, and it is of high value. I can't tell you if it's worth $2.1 million. I know for the families with the children with that disease, it's worth $2.1 million, but they're not the ones paying for it. So I think we've got to disentangle that, and we also have to reflect on the success. Again, most of us weren't doing our current jobs when this legislation was passed. It solved a problem that we've all had solved our entire lives. And it's hard to recognize that we could lose all that. But I think we have to tell the stories, and we have the data on our side. Let's combine the two.
Yeah, and that cost, that the bromide, this is all the cost of development, is in fact, it is the cost of incentivization perhaps, but it's not the cost of development. And the question is to sort of separate what is required for incentivization to drive people to want to do these things that actually are these incredible leaps forward. But at the same time, collectively, we all pay for it. Every person in this room, if there are 2,000 children with spinal muscular atrophy, there will be 2,000 times 2.1 million in our insurance costs. And each of these wonderful, miraculous cures weighs on every single one of us and makes this whole discussion of how our healthcare system can work more difficult, which is, again, part of the reason in the European model they have begun to restrict access, because they have said the collective cannot afford what these spikes have generated in terms of costs. So we have to, again, work on the story so that we can be persuasive, because I think this is the threat to BayhDole.
Let's not just bury what you just said. They're restricting access, which means you don't get it for any price. So, again, which of these evils is
you
worse?
could, if you could buy it outside of the government insurance system. It is available, but you have to buy it outside of the government's insurance system. Our system, everything comes in. And so the price of the insurance altogether is higher.
I think that society does not want these kids to die. Society, we as a community have a responsibility to figure this out, and not by use of a piece of legislation that is providing the luxury of answers to save these kids. So there are two questions we need to answer. We need to answer them in separate ways, and we need to do it together. It's got to be a partnership between all of us, and I think it's fundamentally important. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Steve.
Thank you. I wanted to make 2 points. It's It's a real issue on the drug pricing. It's not going to be solved at the university laboratory where the drug is created, and if we're lucky enough to be able even to transfer it into the next stage of development. The other thing, it's just a personal concern I have. I'm all for the drug. I'm glad to hear political leadership take on drug pricing as a question, knowing that there's a lot of concern about it. But it is very frustrating that we also have relatively affordable drugs that a lot of people who need them aren't getting. So every time somebody brings up drug pricing as an issue on the political side, and they're not talking about universal insurance or means to improve access or equity of care, I'm concerned about that too. So I help make sure that the debate is always balanced, that there's always a broader concern in society. Thank you.
It's an impossibly hard issue we have to solve, and so we're going to do it, but we're going to do it together, I think. Do we have other questions?
I think she had a response.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I was just going to add that, making a sort of overarching point that, of course, one of the challenges in current legislative and policy debates is that these are complicated issues. And looking solely at the patent part side of the equation or patent things or what have you, they are not susceptible to easy solutions. And I would say it's probably, to Joe's credit and the credit of Senators Bayh and Dole, that BayhDole was written in such a way that it is elegant. And so that, therefore, it becomes seen as a sort of easy, elegant solution to some of these very complicated problems. And it's very easy, again, when you have many emotional narratives, quite rightly, that you want to apply what seems like the easiest possible fix.
Right. Which is a really dangerous path in policy, is to look for easy, because it's usually messy.
Hi, my name is Pete Kirkham. I'm with Red Maple Consulting, and full disclosure, one of my clients is Ellie.
Not alone.
So, but the question's not a shill question. So for those of us that lobby or are around public policy, one of the best things about BayhDole is that it, as some of our panelists rightly said, clearly defines a public good, enables a certain type of behavior, and releases the animal spirits of the economy. You get all the best parts of the different facets of our American political system and economic system. But to me, the fundamental thing with the bill is that it removed roadblocks. It got things out of the way. So looking forward, yeah, we have lots of big picture issues to deal with, but looking forward in the narrow scope of technology transfer, basic research, are there roadblocks that are out there that need to be removed now, things we need to be looking at for the next 5 or 10 years? What do we got to get out of the way to enable more progress along these lines?
Want to take that on?
Well, I will. The National Institute of Standards and Technology put out a paper about 6 months ago called the Return on Investment Initiative. And they actually looked at, okay, how do we get more return on investment for what taxpayers are funding in public sector research? And I think they've actually identified some very good issues. And a lot of them actually are not on the university side, but on the federal laboratory side. BayhDole also allows federal laboratories to license their inventions, but as Secretary Ross said when he kicked it off, there's a huge disparity between the impact of university-funded research and federal laboratory-funded research. And a lot of it's not because of legal issues, it's more cultural issues. As we talked about, the fuel of interest to the fires of genius. I've actually done a lot of consulting with different federal labs, and you find the researchers are just like university researchers, but as you go up the chain of command, there's a lot of risk-averse people there who are scared about making deals and don't understand this whole thing, so we just sort of wish this would go away. The problem is culture is much harder to change than law. And we'll see what comes out of this initiative, but I think at least they're recognizing a big problem there because, which is, again, I don't want to hate to paint with a broad brush, but we were talking about the economic impact of university licensing versus federal laboratory licensing. It's a huge disparity. And the funding is about equal. I mean, the federal government's funding about the same amount. Universities get more because they get industry funding, but why are they getting more industry funding? I think the people are seeing a bigger return on investment there. So unfortunately, I think we're not in the area where you can do a BayhDole type thing where you just suddenly cut the Gordian knot and everything flows. Now you're into harder issues, which are cultural. And when you get in the public sector, one of the problems is you get a risk-averse culture. And that doesn't work very well with innovation.
There we go. Yeah, certainly I would commend to all of you the NIST report, as well as to put in a plug the comments of AAU and AAMC and some of our COGR and other associations. And so just to get I totally agree what you say about some cultural challenges, but there also are certainly some practical mechanisms that could help to speed and support technology transfer. So, of course, the good thing about BayhDole is that it's an unfunded mandate. The bad thing is it's an unfunded mandate. So depending on whether you're looking at it from an appropriations standpoint or from a university laboratory standpoint. And so, there are some areas where, for example, additional funding and support for things, sort of mechanisms that would help bridge the valley of death, which is the sort of wonderfully evocative term for trying to take something from a very basic research idea to trying to even just conceptualize and to sort of have enough proof of concept applied to that idea that a company would be interested in licensing it. So even if it doesn't, even if it has a patent, sort of being able to be persuasive. And so I think giving more support to those programs would be critical. And then there are some provisions, certainly of the tax law and others, where they, I think small changes could make a big impact.
If I could just add from the micro level, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we have, as a technology transfer office at the University of Maryland, we have multiple objectives. Faculty entrepreneurship, education, building local ecosystem, economic engagement for the university, and revenue is one of them. And working within BayhDole as it stands now, we have a lot of freedom to address each of those objectives. And so one of the concrete things we've done with our startups, and again, having a startup company come out of the University of Maryland ticks a lot of those boxes, and revenue is just one of them. And so to take the, looking from the outside in, VCs and entrepreneurs think the university is going to take, if they're successful, all the money goes back to the university. So we're trying to get out of the negotiation business and not trying to maximize the value of any deal, but maximize the number of deals, maximize the dissemination and the potential impact of the whole portfolio, not try to maximize the economic return of any one deal. So we have an express license that has standard terms that are backloaded. If in the early stages we take no money out of the company, in fact subsidize some of their activities, but if they're successful, a reasonable return comes back to the university, but only upon their success.
What's been said about roadblocks has been very good. I'd like to add, I think there was an unexpected outcome of BayhDole, or one not originally intended, and that was the development of a professional group within the universities that could actually handle tech transfer and licensing practices. Different universities had some sophistication in it, maybe back in the 70s or 60s, but certainly not every school. And now we pretty much have that. And the organization Ken's representing is the organization for those professionals. And it's also, it's neat to me, if you attend their annual meetings, it's one of the few places where you see the university personnel interacting with personnel from industry and from startups and law offices and things like that, talking about these issues. So it actually helped develop a capacity and a level of sophistication in our institutions that I don't know if that was part of what was envisioned when the law passed.
But it's such a good point. I mean, public-private partnerships has been one of the buzzwords for what now, decade, and I think one of its homes has been in the tech transfer arena to the benefit, a much broader benefit.
Hi, Aaron Kiesler. I represent the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center. You all talked about march-in rights, but on the congressional side, are there specific pieces of legislation in the drug pricing debate that would impact BayhDole that you are all concerned about?
Not specific pieces of legislation, but you've heard very prominent members of Congress publicly threaten to use march-in rights. So I'm not seeing it as a legislative initiative. We're seeing it more quiet. I think it's to the point that was made earlier, that as they get into the details of looking at different competing legislative priorities, the level of unintended consequences, I think, has really stymied negotiations. But there are a number of things that we in the patient community support that are making their way through legislation. But our goal is to make sure that this doesn't become a casualty of those conversations. And the question that was raised earlier, I think, is a really good one. But Winston Churchill said I think it was Winston Churchill, when you have a really big problem that's really difficult to solve, make it bigger. I think you need to make this one bigger, and it goes to the question earlier in terms of the narrative. This problem of cost needs a uniquely American solution. Europe did what it did, has a very different cultural background where society is willing to make those trade-offs. That certain kids are not going to get medicines, and they live with that. Their trade-off was they all have some basic access to care. We in the United States still don't have access to basic care for everybody, and we still have a system that was fundamentally created in a pre-war area based on acute and infectious care. And we're trying to evolve. We haven't gotten there yet. Our system is characterized by huge amounts of waste, most of it centered on the people that we represent, people with complex chronic conditions, often getting inordinate amounts of care that they don't need and want, or getting no care at all. We have this really bizarre dichotomy. And what we're beginning to see with incredible advances in technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, with new clinical research, with science, is a recognition that we've got to treat the whole person. And when you start to look at what's happening in Medicare Advantage and Medicaid managed markets, you're starting to see people look at not just the clinical outcomes that are important, but blending them with the social and behavioral determinants, and actually getting the care that is most appropriate for that segment of the population. Now, nobody is saying clinical aspects are not important, which so many of the people we represent get good clinical care, but it doesn't meet what's important to them, or it's completely useless because they don't have homes, transportation, food, or it's misaligned with their personal goals and objectives. What we're seeing is the payers are actually coming into the National Health Council as members because they're beginning to experiment here. Historically, they didn't want to deal with the patient community. It's a big, big myth out there that we want access to everything. And the reality is, we don't want access to everything. We want access to what will help me live a better life. It's very different. And we often have to go through so many hurdles to get there, driving up costs in the system. And now you have treatments coming out that appear to be durable, that may actually be a one-time cure with a $2.1 million price. How are we going to pay for that? In the current model where we only pay on an annual basis, and if you look at how long somebody's in an insurance product, in Medicaid, often in the same insurance product for less than a year. In the small group market, 14 months. What insurer is going to pay $2.1 million if somebody else gets the benefit of that? Can we start to look at how we pay for health over a longer period? Can we look at how we spread that risk from insurance company to insurance? Can we combine that with outcomes-based contracts that actually have metrics that we care about? We involve insurance, value-based insurance design, where if it's the right care for you, clinically, socially, behaviorally, you don't have a co-insurance of 50% of the cost of that product.
And Mark, I'd say also, if you could capture some of the duplication and waste and the care that patients actually wouldn't want if they actually knew the incremental benefit, capture those savings and apply it to the costs we want, of things we want to pay for, like drugs for kids who are dying. I did want to address on the question about whether you're seeing Bayh-Dole in legislation. You're seeing the ghost of Bayh-Dole in legislation. What you're seeing now in the House particularly is the idea of taking intellectual property rights away if a company won't accept a reasonable price. There's some legislation in the House that has that concept, so it may not be BayhDole specifically, but it is this idea of using intellectual property as the hammer. And again, that is putting innovation at risk for the affordability question instead of trying to find solutions that promote innovation and promote affordability. Are there other questions? There's one other topic I wanted to raise real quick, but questions are more important. So, other audience questions?
They're played out.
Understandably. One thing I want to mention quickly, because we haven't, is that one of the very cool things that where you'll see BayhDole applied and tech transfer applied is actually in biomedical engineering, which we haven't talked about. We've been talking about mostly about drugs. It's very cool, and it's, as a non-engineer, don't even listen to what I'm going to say about engineering. But what I get about it is that the seeds of the idea will happen in the academic community, and then with tech transfer, you bring in all the other expertise in the engineering community to work with the biomedical engineers. And one example I found had to do with a new exoskeleton that is coming out of the University of Berkeley along with the private sector that really looks promising for paralysis. And there are examples like this that are rife. They're actually on the Autumn website. They have a state-by-state kind of database of really cool examples of tech transfer at work. So I commend you to that. Is commend the right word, or am I just trying to sound sophisticated? But look at it when you get a chance. Go to the Autumn website. It's very, very cool. And if there aren't other questions, what I'd love to do is thank our terrific, terrific panelists for this discussion, and thank you all for being part of it with us, and those who have checked in via live stream. It's been fabulous, I think. And let me thank our partners again, AAAS for this lovely auditorium, AAU, and all of our partners for allowing this to take place.